When all hope was lost, the cowboy said, "Not while I'm breathing." The morning sun stretched across the small town of Red Rock, painting the dusty streets with soft golden light. Birds called from the wooden rooftops, and the faint smell of earth after the night's dew hung in the air. In a modest ranch on the outskirts of town, Eli Carter was already awake, standing on the porch of his weathered wooden house. He was a tall man with broad shoulders hardened by years of hard work under the sun, and eyes that seemed to carry the quiet weight of every challenge he had faced. Eli ran a hand through his tangled hair, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. The land he loved so dearly stretched for miles in every direction, rolling plains dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers. Beyond that, the mountains rose in the distance, their peaks glinting in the morning light. It was a beautiful sight, but Eli knew that beauty was fragile. The land had been dry for weeks, and the summer promised to be hotter and harsher than usual. He could feel it in the air, a tension, like the calm before a storm. He turned to the barn where his younger brother Jacob was already feeding the horses. Jacob was 18, full of energy and mischief, but inexperienced in the ways of the ranch. Eli watched as Jacob carefully poured feed into the troughs, ensuring every horse got its share. He smiled faintly, proud of the boy's dedication, but aware that pride alone couldn't protect them from the hardships that lay ahead.
The ranch had been in the Carter family for generations.
Eli's father had taught him to ride before he could even walk properly, and to respect the land as if it were a living, breathing thing. Eli remembered the long days spent learning to mend fences, herd cattle, and work the soil. Those lessons had shaped him, taught him patience and endurance, and gave him a deep understanding of the land's moods. He often thought about how lucky he was to have such knowledge, though he knew it came at the cost of hard labor and sacrifice. Today, Eli had a list of chores to complete before the sun climbed higher. The fences needed repairing after a recent storm, and several of the cows had wandered too close to the dry creek bed. He saddled his horse, a sturdy chestnut named Thunder, feeling the familiar comfort of leather straps against his hands. As he mounted, he glanced at the horizon, noting the faint shimmer of heat already rising from the plains. It was going to be another long, hot day. Eli rode across the property with practiced ease, checking on each section of the ranch. The cows grazed lazily, swishing their tails against the flies. Thunder trotted steadily beneath him, ears flicking at every sound. Eli paused at a fence post that had been loosened by the wind, and started hammering it back into place. The rhythmic sound of wood meeting metal echoed in the quiet morning, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful, almost timeless. But beneath the calm, Ellie felt a nagging unease. The winds had been shifting strangely, carrying with them the scent of smoke from somewhere far beyond the mountains. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to set his instincts on edge. Breath. He shook his head and focused on his work, telling himself it was probably nothing. Smoke could travel for miles in these parts, and there were many ways for it to spread without reaching them. Breaths. Still, a part of him couldn't ignore the warning in the air. After finishing the fence, Eli rode toward the barn to check on the livestock. Jacob was mending a broken harness when Eli arrived, and he looked up with a grin. "Morning, Eli! The horses are ready for the day," Jacob said, his voice bright with youthful energy. "Good job, Jacob," Eli replied, patting the boy on the shoulder. "Just keep an eye on the wind. It feels..." Breath. Jacob nodded but shrugged, brushing off the warning as if it were nothing. Eli knew better. Experience had taught him that nature could turn on a person in an instant, and he had learned to respect its power. By midday, the sun was high, beating down relentlessly. Eli and Jacob worked side by side, fixing fences and moving cattle to safer grazing areas. Sweat poured down their faces, and the smell of dust and horse filled the air. Despite the hard work, Eli felt a sense of satisfaction. There was something honest and pure about laboring on the land, about knowing that every action, every decision, had a direct impact on the life of the ranch and the animals he cared for. As they rested under the shade of an old oak tree, Eli took a moment to look around. The town of Red Rock wasn't large, but it had heart. The townspeople were simple folk, honest and hard-working, who looked out for one another. They faced hardships together, from harsh winters to failed crops, and yet they persisted. Eli admired their resilience. It reminded him of why he loved this place, even when life was hard. "Eli," Jacob said after a long pause, "do you ever worry something bad will happen, like desperate, fire, or a storm?" Eli looked at his brother, seeing the concern in his young eyes. He remembered asking the same questions when he was Jacob's age, the fear of the unknown pressing heavily on him. "Of course I worry," Eli admitted, "but worrying doesn't fix anything. What matters is what you do when things get tough. You can't control everything, but you can control how you respond. That's the difference between giving up and surviving."
Jacob nodded thoughtfully, taking in his brother's words.
There was a quiet wisdom in Eli's voice, a calm certainty that comforted him. For now, at least, the world seemed manageable, even with the heat and the dust and the challenges of the ranch. The afternoon passed with the usual rhythm of ranch life. Eli and Jacob moved cattle to a new pasture, repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by a wandering steer, and checked on the water troughs. Everything seemed normal, almost peaceful, and for a moment, Eli allowed himself to relax. Best. He knew, however, that peace was often fleeting in these parts. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, Eli felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't from the temperature. It was from a growing unease, a sense that the day's calm was fragile, that it could be shattered at any moment. He scanned the distant hills and noticed a thin wisp of smoke curling above the treetops. It was faint, but unmistakable. "Jacob," he called, pointing toward the smoke, "keep an eye on the horses. That wind is picking up. I'm going to ride out and see what's happening." Jacob's eyes widened, but he nodded, trusting his brother's judgment.
Eli mounted Thunder and rode toward the source of the smoke, heart steady but alert.
As he got closer, the smoke became thicker, carrying the sharp, acrid smell of burning wood. His stomach tightened. Wildfires weren't uncommon in these dry months, but something about this one felt different. Larger, faster, more dangerous.
By the time Eli returned to the ranch, the sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the plains bathed in a warm orange glow.
The smoke had grown stronger, and a thin layer of ash floated on the air. He could see the worry etched on Jacob's face, the tension in the horses' muscles as they shifted uneasily in their stalls. Eli took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He knew that the hours ahead would test everything he had learned from years on the ranch. He would have to rely on skill, courage, and quick thinking. But even as the shadow of fear loomed, he felt a familiar spark deep within him, a quiet determination that refused to be extinguished. As night fell, Ellie sat on the porch with Jacob beside him, listening to the wind rustle through the dry grass. The town of Red Rock slept quietly, unaware of the challenge approaching. Eli's mind was already working, planning the steps they would need to take to protect their home and their animals. He didn't know how bad the fire might get, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't let it take everything without a fight. And as the stars began to twinkle above the plains, Eli felt a resolve that had carried him through countless hardships. No matter what the coming days held, he would face it. Retibus. He had learned long ago that hope wasn't about wishing for the best. It was about taking action, standing strong when others might falter. And he would stand strong. Always. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the plains, but the golden light seemed muted, hazed by the smoke that had crept across the horizon overnight. Eli Carter was awake before dawn as usual, his eyes scanning the distant hills. The thin wisp of smoke he had seen the day before had grown thicker, curling higher into the sky. The air smelled faintly of ash, dry and sharp, and even from the ranch, Eli could sense that trouble was approaching. He saddled Thunder quickly, his mind focused. Today, the task was not only to care for the cattle and the horses, but to assess the threat coming closer from the hills. The ranch had always been resilient, but a wildfire could destroy everything in minutes if it wasn't faced with careful planning and swift action. Eli had faced storms, floods, and harsh winters before, but the fire was different, faster, unpredictable, and merciless. Jacob, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, helped Eli secure the gear. His youthful energy was tempered with worry, though he tried to mask it with a forced grin. "Do you think it'll reach us, Eli?" he asked quietly. Eli studied the distant hills, the smoke now rising in a dark, twisting column. I don't know, he said honestly. "But we can't wait to find out. We have to be ready. Whatever comes, we face it together." The horses shifted nervously under their hooves, sensing the tension in the air. Eli gave Thunder a reassuring pat and mounted, motioning for Jacob to follow. Together they rode across the ranch, checking fences and moving the cattle toward a safer section of land near the creek. The ground was dry and brittle, and even the smallest spark could set it ablaze. Eli's heart pounded as he worked, knowing that every decision now could make the difference between survival and disaster. By mid-morning, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of smoke deeper into the ranch. The sky, once blue, was tinged with gray and orange, and the sound of distant crackling reached Eli's ears. The fire was no longer a threat. Somewhere far away, it was moving closer, faster than he had expected. "Ellie!" Jacob called out, pointing toward the northern pastures. "The smoke. It's thickening over there. It looks like it's spreading." Eli's jaw tightened, but he could see the edges of the fire flickering against the hills, bright and fierce. The wind was pushing it toward the ranch, and there was no time to waste. He quickly assessed the situation. The horses and cattle needed to be moved immediately, and the barn and equipment had to be protected as best as possible. "Grab the ropes in the saddles," Eli instructed. "We'll lead the horses to the lower pasture near the creek. It's the safest spot right now." Jacob nodded, scrambling to gather the gear. The two brothers worked quickly, shouting to the animals to keep them moving. The horses neighed in panic, their muscles tense as they sensed the danger. Eli stayed calm, using his experience to guide them, speaking in low, steady tones. The animals trusted him, and slowly they began to move in the direction he wanted. As they reached the lower pasture, a sudden gust of wind carried sparks from the fire, landing dangerously close to the dry grass. Eli's heart skipped a beat. A single spark could ignite the entire field. He grabbed a water bucket and began dousing the grass, while Jacob helped move the remaining horses to safety. Sweat poured down their faces, mixing with the ash in the air, but they didn't stop. There was no time for fear, only action. The fire was relentless, creeping closer with each passing minute. The roar of the flames could be heard now, a constant, menacing sound that made the ground vibrate beneath their feet. The brothers worked tirelessly, moving livestock, dousing sparks, and securing the barn as best they could. Even as the fire approached, Eli refused to panic. His mind raced, calculating every possible way to protect the ranch, to save his family, and to survive. Then came the moment that made Eli's blood run cold. A loud crash echoed across the property. The wind had knocked over a dry fence near the barn, and flames were now licking at the wooden beams. Psst. Eli's eyes widened, but he didn't hesitate. He grabbed Jacob's arm. Listen to me, Jacob. We have to get the horses inside the barn first. Nothing else matters right now. Together, they raced toward the barn, guiding the remaining animals inside. Smoke filled their lungs, stinging their eyes, but they pushed forward. The fire crackled closer, and the heat grew intense, making it difficult to breathe. Eli could feel his strength being tested to the limit, but he refused to give in. Finally, the last horse was safely inside the barn.
Eli stepped back, wiping ash from his face, and looked at the fire raging around them.
The situation was dire. The wind was unpredictable. The flames were spreading, and the dry grass all around threatened to ignite at any moment. It felt as though all hope was slipping away.
"Eli, what do we do now?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling slightly.
Eli took a deep breath, his mind steady despite the chaos. He knew there was only one thing to do: fight with everything they had.
"We keep going," he said firmly. "We protect what we can.
Not while I'm breathing will we give up." With that resolve, Eli began moving strategically, creating fire breaks by clearing dry grass around the barn, dousing sparks with water and using blankets to smother small flames. Jacob followed, helping wherever he could. The fire roared around them, but they refused to back down. Every action mattered, and every second counted. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of smoke, heat, and hard work. The brothers were exhausted, their clothes soaked with sweat and ash, but their determination never wavered. Eli's leadership kept them focused, his calm presence inspiring Jacob to push beyond his fear. Together they managed to slow the fire's advance, protecting the barn and the lower pasture where the horses were safe. As the sun began to set, the fire finally started to lose some of its intensity, the wind shifting in a direction that carried the flames away from the ranch. Eli collapsed onto the ground, panting, covered in soot and sweat. Jacob sat beside him, equally exhausted, but relief shone in his eyes. "We did it," Jacob whispered, disbelief in his voice. "We actually did it."
Eli nodded, though he knew the fight wasn't completely over. The fire had caused damage, and some livestock had been lost, but the ranch and their family had survived.
That was what mattered. As darkness fell, Eli and Jacob stood together surveying the aftermath. The land smelled of smoke, and the night was quiet except for the distant crackle of burning wood. The ranch bore the scars of the fire, but it was still standing. And in that moment, Eli felt a deep sense of pride and relief. They had faced the fire head-on, and they had survived. Eli knew that the days ahead would be filled with rebuilding and recovery, but he also knew that they had the strength and courage to face whatever came next. The fire had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but it had also shown them what they were capable of. And as he looked at Jacob, tired but determined, Eli felt a quiet certainty that no challenge could break their spirit, not as long as they faced it together. That night, as the stars appeared in the sky, Eli sat on the porch once more, breathing in the cool night air. The ranch was safe for now, the horses secure, and his family alive. He knew the fire would leave a mark on the land, but it would not leave a mark on their hope. And as he whispered to himself, he felt the truth of his own words. "Not while I'm breathing." The morning after the fire arrived quietly, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The sun rose over red rock, casting pale light across the plains, but the world felt different. Where the golden grass had once swayed gently in the breeze, Blackened stubs of earth stood stubbornly against the wind. Smoke lingered in the air, faint but persistent, a reminder of the destruction that had passed through. Carter stepped onto the porch of his home, surveying the land with a heavy heart. The ranch had survived the fire, but it was far from untouched. The fences had been scorched in places, and parts of the barn had suffered burns that would take weeks to repair. Some of the cattle had been lost, and the pasture that had been lush just days ago now bore the scars of the blaze. Even the air smelled different, heavy with ash and charred wood. Eli took a deep breath, steadying himself. Despite the loss, he knew that despair would not help. They had survived, and survival meant there was hope. Jacob appeared behind him, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His youthful energy had been tempered by the fire, but there was a determination in his stance that matched his older brother's. "It's worse than I thought," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. Eli nodded. "It's bad," he admitted, "but it's not the end. We can fix this. We'll rebuild, just like we always do." The first step was to assess the damage in detail. Eli and Jacob walked through the ranch, inspecting fences, checking the remaining cattle, and examining the barn. The fire had spared the animals they had worked so hard to protect, and that alone felt like a victory. But the losses were still real. A few of the cows had perished, and a section of fencing near the northern pasture had been completely destroyed. The brothers worked in silence for a while, letting the magnitude of the task settle in their minds. "Do you think the neighbors fared any better?" Jacob asked. Eli shook his head. "I'm not sure. The fire moved fast. Some of them might have lost a lot. We'll find out soon. Bray." He paused, looking at the burnt horizon. "But first we take care of what's ours. That's what we can control." The brothers began by repairing the fences closest to the barn. The work was painstaking, each post needing to be replaced, each plank carefully secured. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them with relentless intensity, but they worked steadily, fueled by the need to protect what remained. Sweat poured down their faces, and ash clung to their hair and clothing, but they did not stop. As they worked, neighbors began to arrive. Some were covered in soot, their homes and land showing signs of damage, while others had suffered more severe losses. Despite their own troubles, they came to help. In small towns like Red Rock, neighbors relied on one another, and even in disaster, the bonds of community remained strong. Eli welcomed them with quiet gratitude. Together they began to clear debris, mend fences, and salvage what they could from the scorched land. Hours turned into the afternoon, and slowly, the ranch began to feel alive again. The fences stood taller, repaired and steady, and the animals were secure in their enclosures. Eli paused to look at the barn. Though it had been scorched on one side, the structure was solid. They could rebuild it, stronger than before. He felt a flicker of pride. They had survived the fire, and now it was time to rebuild. But rebuilding was not just physical. The fire had left an emotional mark on everyone who had witnessed it, perhaps. Eli saw it in Jacob's eyes, in the tired faces of the neighbors, and even in his own reflection. Fear had tested them, and loss had touched their hearts. Yet, in that same fear and loss, there was courage, there was resilience, and there was a determination to rise again. That evening, Eli and Jacob sat outside the barn, resting. The air was still hazy with smoke, and the land bore the deep, dark scars of the fire. But there was also a sense of calm, a quiet promise that life would continue. "We can do this, Eli," Jacob said softly. "We can rebuild." "We have to!" Eli nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yes, and not just rebuild. We'll make it better than it was before. We'll learn from this fire, and we'll be stronger. The next days were filled with relentless work. Eli and Jacob, along with the neighbors who had come to help, repaired fences, cleared burnt fields, and reinforced the barn. Breaths. Each day brought new challenges, from stubborn fence posts to weather that threatened to undo their efforts. But with every hurdle they pushed forward. Their hands grew calloused, their bodies ached, but their spirits remained unbroken. Through it all, Eli never lost sight of what mattered most: the survival and safety of his family and the animals they had protected. Every decision he made was deliberate, grounded in experience and an unwavering commitment to the land and its creatures. Jacob watched him closely, learning not only the skills of the ranch, but also the deeper lesson of resilience. As the days passed, the ranch slowly began to take shape again. The fields were cleared, new fences stood tall, and the barn had been partially rebuilt. Eli felt a sense of pride and satisfaction in the progress they had made. But he also knew the fire had changed them. The land bore scars that would take time to heal, and the experience had tested their courage in ways that would stay with them forever. One afternoon, as they rested under the shade of a large oak tree, Eli reflected on what had happened. The fire had come with unexpected speed, threatening to take everything they had worked for. Yet, through courage, quick thinking, and the support of neighbors, they had survived. He realized that hope was not a passive feeling. It was an action, a choice, to face adversity with strength and determination. Jacob looked at him, eyes wide. "Eli, I think I understand now. Hope isn't just wishing things get better. It's doing something about it." Eli smiled, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Exactly, Jacob. You take what you have, and you fight for it." "That's hope. And we have plenty to fight for." Began to heal as well. Neighbors helped each other rebuild homes, shared resources, and offered support to those who had suffered losses. The town, though touched by fire, demonstrated the strength that came from unity and determination. Eli felt a quiet sense of pride in being part of that community. Together they had faced disaster and had not been defeated. At night, after long days of labor, Eli often sat quietly outside, listening to the wind whisper through the recovering fields. The land was beginning to show signs of life once more, green shoots sprouting among the blackened soil. It was a reminder that even after devastation, renewal was possible. Jacob would sometimes join him, and together they would talk about the future, about what they hoped to achieve, and the lessons they had learned. Eli realized that the fire had not only tested them, but it also taught them about courage, perseverance, and the power of community. The experience had left them stronger, more connected to the land, and more determined to protect what they had built.
Weeks turned into months, and the ranch continued to recover.
The barn was fully rebuilt, fences repaired, and the pastures were slowly turning green again. The animals thrived, and life on the ranch returned to a rhythm, albeit one tempered by the memory of the fire. Eli and Jacob worked side by side, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced together. Eli often thought back to the moment when the fire had threatened to consume everything. He remembered the fear, the heat, the smoke, and the chaos. But he also remembered the determination, the teamwork, and the courage that had carried them through. That memory became a source of strength, a reminder that even in the darkest times, resilience and hope could prevail. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Eli stood on the porch looking out over the recovering land. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment and gratitude. The fire had taken much, but it had not taken their spirit, their family, or their home. And as he turned to see Jacob walking toward him, carrying a bucket of water for the horses, Eli knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The fire had left scars, but it had also left lessons. Eli had learned the true meaning of courage and responsibility, and Jacob had learned the importance of resilience and hope. Together they had survived, and together they would rebuild. Not just the ranch, but their lives, and their community. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Eli whispered quietly to himself as he had during the fire, "Not while I'm breathing." The words were no longer just a promise. They were a guiding principle, a reminder that hope and action could overcome even the greatest challenges.
Spring arrived slowly on the plains around Red Rock, carrying with it the promise of renewal.
The air was crisp, filled with the fresh scent of growing grass and blossoming wildflowers. For Eli Carter, it was a season of hope and reflection, a time to see how far the ranch and his family had come since the fire had threatened to take everything. The land still bore the marks of the fire, the blackened soil a constant reminder of the destruction they had faced. But new life was emerging. Green shoots were pushing through the scorched earth, delicate and determined. Eli walked along the fence line, his hands brushing against the tops of the young grass, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The ranch was healing, and so were they. Jacob joined him, carrying a small bucket of feed for the horses. His face was bright with energy and pride, though he moved with the careful precision that came from months of hard work.
"It's coming back, Eli," he said, looking around.
Beck,
"Everything we saved is growing again." Eli smiled, ruffling his brother's hair.
"Yes, Jacob. It's slow, but it's coming back. And that's what matters, Britt. Life always finds a way, no matter how hard the storm or the fire may be."
The morning was filled with work, but this time it was not only about survival. It was about improvement. Eli had learned much from the fire, about the importance of preparation, the value of teamwork, and the need to respect the land.
He began reinforcing fences with stronger posts, adding fire breaks around key areas, and carefully planning how to make the ranch safer and more resilient. Neighbors stopped by throughout the day, sharing news and lending hands where needed. Many had faced similar struggles, but the fire had brought the community closer together. People exchanged tips for better water management, ways to protect livestock, and methods to prevent future fires from causing as much damage. The town of Red Rock was alive with energy and collaboration, and Eli felt a deep sense of belonging. Together, they were stronger than they had ever been. As the days turned into weeks, the ranch transformed. The barn, which had been scorched but sturdy, was now rebuilt and reinforced with fresh timber. The pastures were lush again, dotted with cattle grazing peacefully under the sun. The fences, once broken and charred, now stood straight and firm, a testament to the labor and determination that had carried them through the fire. Eli and Jacob worked side by side every day, the bond between them stronger than ever. The fire had tested their courage, and the months of rebuilding had tested their endurance. But through it all, they had learned to trust each other completely.
Eli guided Jacob with patience, teaching him skills that went beyond ranch work, lessons of resilience, foresight, and the importance of never giving up, no matter how hopeless a situation seemed.
One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Eli rode out on Thunder to check the northern pasture. The wind was gentle, carrying the sweet scent of growing grass and wildflowers. As he looked across the land, he saw the animals grazing calmly, their movements relaxed and unafraid. It was a simple sight, but it filled him with pride. Every blade of grass, every horse and cow was a symbol of survival and renewal. Jacob joined him, riding a smaller horse alongside Thunder. "It feels good to see everything coming back," he said, his voice filled with awe.
I never thought we'd get through it.
Eli nodded. "We did. And not just because we worked hard, but because we refused to give up." "Remember that, Jacob. Life will test you in ways you can't always predict, but as long as you keep breathing, you keep fighting. That's how you survive, and that's how you grow." But weeks turned into months, and the ranch continued to flourish. Eli took time to teach Jacob more than just ranch skills. They discussed strategy, leadership, and the importance of community. Eli wanted his brother to understand that strength was not only measured in physical work, but in courage, resilience, and the ability to inspire others. News of their survival and recovery spread through Red Rock. People admired how the Carter brothers had faced the fire and rebuilt their ranch from nearly nothing. Children listened wide-eyed as neighbors recounted the story of the fire and the courage displayed. When all hope was lost, Eli Carter said, "Not while I'm breathing," they would repeat, the words carrying through the town like a mantra of courage and determination. Eli never sought recognition, but he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that their story inspired others. The fire had tested them, but it had also given them a gift, the opportunity to teach hope, resilience, and the value of never giving up. Every time he looked across the plains at the thriving ranch, he was reminded that even the darkest times could lead to growth and renewal. One day, as Eli was repairing a fence near the eastern pasture, Jacob came running toward him, holding a small notebook.
"Eli, I've been writing down everything we did after the fire."
"I want to remember it all, so we never forget what we're capable of." Eli smiled, taking the notebook and flipping through the pages, filled with detailed notes and sketches. "This is good, Jacob, not just for us, but for anyone who might face challenges like this in the future. Knowledge and experience are powerful, especially when combined with courage." Breaths. The brothers continued their work, planting new trees along the fence lines, reinforcing water sources, and improving the pastures. Every improvement made the ranch safer, stronger, and more beautiful than before. It was a slow process, but the results were visible. The land was alive again, vibrant and full of promise. As the sun set each evening, Eli often paused to reflect. He thought about the fire, the hours of fear and chaos, and the months of relentless work that had followed. The experience had changed him, but it had also shaped him into someone stronger, more patient, and more aware of the importance of community and family. He realized that survival was not just about protecting what you have. It was about growing, learning, and passing on wisdom to those who come after you. Jacob sat beside him on the porch one evening, watching the sun sink behind the mountains.
"Eli," he said quietly, "I think I understand now. The fire didn't just take things away.
It taught us how to be strong and how to take care of what matters."
Eli put an arm around his brother's shoulders.
Yes, Jacob, that's exactly right.
The fire tested us, but it also showed us what we're made of. And now we can use that knowledge to protect the ranch, our family, and our future. Life returned to a steady rhythm. Days were filled with work on the ranch, evenings with reflection and rest, and weekends often brought neighbors to help with improvements or share stories. The sense of community had never been stronger. Eli knew that they had faced a great challenge, but the experience had forged bonds that could not be broken. The years passed, and the story of the fire became part of the town's history.
Eli continued to work the ranch, teaching Jacob everything he knew.
The ranch thrived more than ever, its fences strong, pastures green, and animals healthy. But beyond the physical improvements, Eli took pride in the lessons learned and passed on, the importance of courage, resilience, hope, and community. One crisp morning, Eli stood on the highest hill on the ranch, looking out over the land. The sunrise painted the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold, and the wind carried the fresh scent of new growth. He felt a sense of peace and accomplishment. The ranch had been tested by fire and hardship, yet it had endured. Breath. And he had endured alongside it, stronger and wiser than before. Jacob rode up beside him, smiling. "The ranch looks amazing, Ellie. I'm proud of everything we've done." Eli smiled back, resting a hand on his brother's shoulder.
"We did it together, Jacob!"
That's what makes it meaningful.
And we'll keep taking care of it every day for as long as we're able.
Not just surviving, but thriving.
The story of Eli Cotter and the fire became a tale told in Red Rock for generations.
Brace. Children grew up hearing about the bravery, determination, and hope that carried the ranch through disaster. Neighbors often recounted the story of the young cowboy who refused to give up, who stood strong when all seemed lost, and who reminded everyone that hope and action could overcome even the greatest challenges. And every time Eli walked the ranch at sunrise, he remembered those words he had whispered during the fire. Not while I'm breathing. They had become more than a promise. They were a way of life, a guiding principle that shaped everything he did. The fire had tested him, but it had also revealed the strength, courage, and resilience that lay within. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Eli felt a quiet joy. The ranch was alive, the land flourishing, and the animals thriving. He knew that life would always bring challenges, but he also knew that they were capable of facing them. Together, as a family, and as a community, they had survived, rebuilt, and grown stronger than ever before. Eli turned to look at Jacob, smiling as the young man rode thunder across the pasture.
We've come a long way, Eli said softly. And we'll keep going, no matter what.
Eli laughed quietly, nodding in agreement. The words, once a promise whispered in the face of fear, had become a truth they lived every day.
Life had tested them, fire had challenged them, and yet here they were, stronger, wiser, and full of hope. The ranch would continue to grow, the land would continue to heal, and the story of courage and determination would live on. And in every gust of wind, every blade of green grass, and every sunrise over the plains, the spirit of resilience that had carried them through would endure forever.